February 19th, 1934, New Bern, North Carolina, 2:30 p.m. A cold wind from the Neuse River beats into the backs of the sparse procession gathered at Cedar Grove Cemetery. Under a leaden sky, the body of a 66-year-old man is being lowered into the ground. The next day, the local newspaper, New Bern Tribune, will publish an obituary calling the deceased an honorary citizen, member of the Masonic Lodge and Bank, former commander of the state naval militia. But this text will not mention the main thing. The man who was just buried died as a hired worker in someone else's pharmacy, standing behind the counter of the very business he once owned outright. His name? Caleb Davis Bradham. And this is not just the funeral of a local pharmacist. This is the finale of one of the most grandiose financial collapses in the history of American industry. At the moment when clods of earth strike the coffin lid, the fortune that this man created no longer belongs to him. A decade earlier, in a courtroom just a few blocks from the cemetery, the gavel fell, a sound far more terrifying than a pistol shot. This sound marked the death of an empire. The assets of the company that Bradham had built for 20 years were sold to a group of investors called Craven Holding Corporation. The deal amounted to $30,000. Today, adjusted for inflation, that's about $525,000. The price of a 3-bedroom apartment for a brand that will be worth more than $160 billion a century later. To understand the anatomy of this fall, we need to shift our gaze from the grave to the house that still stands at the corner of Johnson Street and East Front Street. House number 201, the Slover Bradham Mansion. This red brick building, constructed in the Renaissance style back in 1848, looks like a fortress. Massive cornices, cast iron grills, windows resembling embrasures. During the Civil War, it housed the headquarters of Union General Ambrose Burnside. The walls of this house have witnessed the change of power, the collapse of the Old South. But the harshest siege occurred here not in the 19th century, amid the roar of cannons, but in the 1920s, in the silence of an office, under the rustle of telegraph tapes with stock quotes. It was in this mansion that Caleb Bradham made the decision that destroyed his legacy. There is no place here for mysticism or family curses. The cause of the disaster has a specific chemical name: sucrose, sugar, white gold, the price of which in 1920 became the deadliest weapon on the market. Imagine this house in the days of its glory. 1908. Bradham buys the mansion for $13,000, a colossal sum equal to an ordinary worker's earnings over 20 years. He is at the peak. His drink is sold in 24 states. He is the king of New Bern. He enters these doors as a victor, as a man who rewrote the rules of the game. But if you look closely at the documents of that time, you can see cracks in the foundation, even before they became obvious. The story we are about to uncover is not a tale about soda. It is a thriller about hubris, about miscalculation, and about how one figure in a stock report can turn a magnate into a bankrupt in a matter of weeks. We will see how a man endowed with the gift of foresight was blind to the most obvious risk. We will walk through the rooms of the mansion on Johnson Street, where every detail of the interior screamed of eternity, while the financial reports on the owner's desk already whispered of the inevitable end. Bradham was not killed by competitors. Coca-Cola did not destroy him in direct combat in those years. He did it himself. And the instrument of this suicide was his own conviction that the market would grow forever. Now, standing at his grave in 1934, we see only the finale. But to understand the mechanism of the disaster, we need to rewind time. We need to go back to that moment when a young medical student from North Carolina was forced to drop out of school due to his father's bankruptcy. unaware that this scenario, losing everything due to external circumstances, would become the main leitmotif of his own life. This is not a story about how money is made. This is a story about how it disappears. Welcome inside the ruined fortune of Pepsi's founder. To understand the nature of the disaster that befell Caleb Bradham in the 1920s, it is necessary to return to the origins of his obsession with control. His path began not with success, but with a deep personal trauma that defined his attitude toward money for the rest of his life. 1891. 24-year-old Caleb is studying at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. His dream is to become a surgeon. This is status. This is respect. This is a guarantee of security. But suddenly, he receives a letter from home, from North Carolina.
His father, George Washington Bradham, declares bankruptcy. The family business has collapsed. There is no more money to pay for his studies. This moment became the first pivotal hook in his biography. Young Caleb is forced to shamefully withdraw his documents and return to the province. He did not become a doctor. He became a teacher in a modest school and then a hired employee in a pharmacy. Remember this psychological shift. A man who was supposed to cut flesh and save lives ended up behind the counter, selling pills and ointments. It was this mismatch between ambitions and reality that bred in him a thirst for revenge. He did not want to be just a shopkeeper. If he could not treat people with a scalpel, he decided to treat them with something accessible to everyone. In 1893, Bradham opens his own establishment, Bradham Drug Company. This happens in New Bern, at the corner of Middle Street and Pollock Street. New Bern of that time is a city trying to restore its dignity after the Civil War and Reconstruction. It is a place where the old Southern aristocracy was slowly fading, giving way to new, aggressive entrepreneurs. Bradham's pharmacy quickly becomes not just a store, but the social center of the city. Inside, it smells of medicinal herbs, alcohol, and vanilla. In the center of the hall stands the apparatus that will change its creator's fate: a soda fountain. At the end of the 19th century, pharmacies were unique hybrids of medical institutions and interest clubs. People came here to complain about life and health. Bradham listened. He heard the same complaint again and again: dyspepsia, stomach disorder, heaviness after eating. The Southern diet of that time was fatty and heavy. And here the failed doctor saw his chance. He began experimenting with chemical compounds, mixing them not in laboratory test tubes, but in soda glasses. His recipe was not accidental. It was cold calculation.
The composition included cola nut extract, vanilla, rare oils, and, most importantly, pepsin, a digestive enzyme that breaks down proteins. Initially, the drink was named Brad's Drink. It sounded provincial and small. Bradham understood this. His ambitions extended beyond the state borders. On August 28, 1898, he makes the move that separates the visionary from the craftsman. He renames the liquid Pepsi Cola. Note the naming strategy. The name directly pointed to two active components, pepsin and cola. This was a claim to medical functionality. In an era when cocaine and opium were still commonly found in medicines, Bradham offered a healthy alternative. He was not selling pleasure. He was selling energy and digestion. His slogan read, "Energizes, strengthens, aids digestion." The price was 5 cents per glass. This was brilliant pricing strategy, luxury accessible even to the poor. But who was his enemy? Who was he up against? At the beginning of the 20th century, his main rival was not Coca-Cola, which was still just gaining momentum in Atlanta. His enemy
was provincialism and lack of capital. Caleb was an outsider. He was a representative of new money in a city that worshipped old family names. To break through, he needed to become more than just a pharmacist. He needed a corporation. In 1902, Pepsi Cola Company was officially registered. In the first year, Bradham sold 7,968 gallons of syrup. This seems like a lot, but for big business, it was a drop in the ocean. However, Bradham saw what others did not. He understood that the money lay not in selling soda glasses to the end consumer, but in selling franchises for dispensing syrup. This was a scaling model that allowed capturing territories without colossal investments in own factories at the start. Caleb Bradham was a complex figure. On one hand, he was a deeply religious Methodist, a member of the Masonic Lodge, a man of duty. On the other, he was a gambler. Risk was woven into his DNA. Creating a company from scratch in an economically depressed region required a certain dose of madness. He believed in scientific progress and that chemistry could solve humanity's problems. His office in the back of the pharmacy turned into headquarters. The walls were hung with maps and charts. He personally developed the logo, an ornate, complex inscription designed to look authoritative, like a doctor's signature on a prescription. Social conflict was brewing. Bradham was getting rich. By 1905, he had already begun changing the landscape of New Bern. But even then, a dangerous tendency was evident in his actions. He sought to control every aspect of production. He did not trust suppliers. He wanted to own the supply chain. It was this trait, the desire for absolute independence from the market, that would later play a cruel trick on him. Meanwhile, at the beginning of the century, he looked like the embodiment of the American dream. A man who lost the chance to become a doctor found a way to treat the nation, earning millions in the process. But behind the facade of success lurked a time bomb. The business's dependence on one single ingredient, whose price Bradham could not control: sugar. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, Caleb Bradham approached the line separating a simple millionaire from an industrial magnate. He needed a symbol of power. He needed an ally. And he needed a house that would silence all those who remembered him as the son of a bankrupt. In the next part, we will see how a strategic marriage and the purchase of the famous mansion transformed his position in society, and how the merger of two worlds created an illusion of invulnerability that blinded him to the coming storm. January 1st, 1901. On this day, Caleb Bradham makes a deal that is as important to his empire as the trademark registration. He gets married. His chosen one, Charity Cradle. And this is not just a romantic union. This is a strategic merger of capitals and statuses that finally secures Bradham's position in the upper echelons of North Carolina society. Charity comes from a respected family. Her name opens those doors that remained closed to the son of a bankrupt, even despite his growing bank account. In the world of Southern aristocracy, money smells, but old connections have no smell. Bradham understood. For his business to survive, he needed not only syrup, but also a foundation. Charity became that foundation. This marriage transforms Caleb's social position. From an ambitious pharmacist, he turns into a pillar of society. Note how his public image changes in these years. He no longer stands behind the counter in an apron. He puts on a uniform. In 1904, he becomes a lieutenant in the North Carolina Naval Militia, and later rises to the rank of commander, lieutenant commander. Photographs from that time show us a man with a stern gaze, dressed in a perfectly tailored uniform with golden epaulets. This is a visual metaphor for how he ran his business: strict hierarchy, discipline, expansion. He built Pepsi Cola like a war machine. By 1908, this machine was operating at full capacity. More than 250 franchisees across the country were dispensing his drink. Money was flowing like a river, and it needed to be materialized. Bradham needed a throne room. He needed physical proof that he had defeated his father's fate. It was then that his gaze fell on the building at number 201 on Johnson Street, the Slover Mansion. This choice was an act of psychological aggression toward the old world. The house was built in the mid-19th century by wealthy merchant Charles Slover. It was the embodiment of old money, a brick palace in the neo-Renaissance style that survived war, occupation, and economic crises. During the Civil War, it housed the headquarters of General Ambrose Burnside, the man whose sideburns gave the word sideburns its name, and whose boots trampled the parquet in the living room. By buying this house, Bradham was buying history. He was essentially telling the city, "Now I am the general here." The deal amounted to $13,000. To understand the scale of this figure, it needs to be translated into man-hours. The average annual income of a carpenter or factory worker in North Carolina in those years barely exceeded $500. Bradham shelled out 26 annual salaries of an ordinary person for the house. This was not just a real estate purchase, it was a demonstration of the chasm that now separated him from who he had been just 10 years earlier. December 28, 1908, Bradham signs the documents. From this moment, the mansion officially becomes the Slover Bradham House. Note the hyphen. He did not erase the previous owner's name. He appended his own to the history, as an equal. This is classic nouveau riche behavior, wanting his money to acquire the patina of time. The house stands at the corner, its facade facing the Neuse River, the main trade artery of the region. This is a strategic position. From its windows, Bradham could see not just a landscape, but logistics routes. The building's architecture worked for the owner's image. This was not the light, airy Victorian style with wooden lace trimmings popular at the time. This was heavy, massive brick. Strict symmetry. Windows resembling observation posts. The entrance with heavy double doors that opened only for the select few. Here, the old met the new. Pre-war Southern traditions merged with the aggressive capitalism of the 20th century. Bradham installed modern technologies into this old shell. Electricity, telephone lines, everything that symbolized progress. This merger of two worlds, the aristocratic past of his wife and the house with Bradham's own industrial present, created a powerful social shield. It seemed that this union was unbreakable. By 1910, Caleb Bradham was more than just a businessman. He was a candidate for governor, almost. He was the head of People's Bank. He was the chairman of the Craven County Board of Commissioners. The house on Johnson Street became the center of gravity for the state's political and business elite. But in this grandeur, the first systemic failure was already embedded. The purchase of the house and the lifestyle it dictated required a constant influx of huge sums of cash. Bradham began withdrawing money from the company's operations to maintain this facade. He mixed personal ambitions with corporate finances. The house demanded servants, receptions, repairs, new furniture from Europe. It became a black hole for capital. And while Bradham enjoyed the view from the balcony of his brick castle, the first storm clouds began forming on world markets, which he, blinded by the shine of his own success, preferred not to notice. The purchase of the house in 1908 became the peak of the parabola. After that, the trajectory could only go down, although at that moment, no one, including Bradham himself, understood this. He created the perfect scenery for his life, but forgot that scenery does not protect from an earthquake. We stand before the massive doors of the mansion. Let us open them and enter inside to see how the psychology of the owner was reflected in the interiors, and to find there traces of the impending collapse. We cross the threshold of the Slover Bradham mansion. The first thing that strikes the senses is the unnatural silence. Walls half a meter thick, built of fired brick, cut off the sounds of the city, creating a vacuum. This is not just a house, it is a resonator of its owner's ego. Entering here in 1910, a guest entered not a living space, but a meticulously staged scenery of success. The first floor hall, wide and dark, served as a psychological airlock. Here, under a high ceiling with stucco, any visitor, whether a loan seeker or a state senator, had to feel their insignificance before the scale of the host. The mansion's interior is a map of Caleb Bradham's consciousness. To the left of the entrance was the living room. Note the fireplaces. There are several, but the main ones are clad in marble. Marble is cold, heavy, eternal. Bradham, whose fortune was built on liquid syrup and sugar, fluid and soluble substances, subconsciously surrounded himself with materials that cannot be destroyed. The furniture in this room was made of mahogany and walnut. Heavy Victorian armchairs, upholstered in velvet, stood like thrones. Every chair leg, every carved armrest screamed of stability. This was architectural deception. Bradham tried to convince himself and the world that his empire was as solid as this walnut table, although in reality, it rested on stock exchange quotes. Let us proceed to the dining room. This was the heart of Bradham's social strategy. Here, under the light of a huge chandelier converted from gas to electricity, a symbol of progress that he adored, the elite of North Carolina gathered. Imagine the sound. The clink of silverware against the finest porcelain imported from Europe. Bradham sat at the head of the table. In these moments, he was not a pharmacist. He was a patrician. Here, they discussed not soda formulas, but politics, bank rates, and the future of the South. The dining room walls, papered with expensive wallpaper, absorbed conversations worth thousands of dollars. But it was precisely here, in this crystal sparkle, that Bradham lost touch with reality. When you drink wine in a hall resembling a museum, it is hard to believe that the price of sugar can collapse your life in one day. Let us ascend the main staircase. The railings are polished by thousands of touches. On the second floor was the Holy of Holies, the personal office and library. If the first floor was a stage for the public, then here, among the bookshelves, Bradham was alone with his demons. It was in this room, behind a massive secretary desk, that he made the decisions leading to catastrophe. Here lay the telegraph tapes. Here it smelled of ink and tobacco. The space was organized so that the owner felt complete control. The office windows overlooked the street, allowing observation of city life from above while remaining unseen. The position of a god. The position that makes one forget caution. The house had more than 10 main rooms, not counting the servants' quarter. The total living area exceeded 4,000 square feet, about 370 square meters. For a family of several people, this was excessive. But functionality was never the main goal. The main goal was dominance. The lighting detail is interesting. Bradham installed electricity in the old house, one of the most expensive innovations of the time. The wires were hidden in the walls, drilled through century-old masonry. The light came on with the flick of a switch. This was a metaphor for his business. Instant results, the magic of technology. He believed he could manage the market as easily as turning on the light in his living room. But in this architectural symphony,
there was one false note that few noticed. The house was too old for a man of the new time. Bradham, an innovator and creator of a global brand, lived in the scenery of the previous century. He tried to squeeze into the suit of an aristocrat that was not his size. The mansion required colossal maintenance expenses.
In winter, these high ceilings made the rooms icy, requiring tons of coal for heating. In summer, the brick walls turned the house into an oven. It was a capricious, demanding monster that devoured cash as quickly as inflation grew. By 1915, this house had become not just a home, but a golden cage. Bradham, surrounded by mirrors and gilded frames, saw in them the reflection of a successful magnate. But the mirrors lied. They showed the external shell, hiding the internal anxiety. Every evening, ascending to his bedroom, he passed by portraits and expensive vases that whispered to him, "You must earn more to keep us." The property stopped serving the master began serving the property. The architectural psychology of the Slover Bradham house reveals the main conflict of its owner: the fear of returning to poverty. He built a fortress to protect himself from the ghost of his father's bankruptcy. He did not know that the most destructive forces were not outside, behind the thick walls, but inside, in his own head, in his unbridled ambition and belief in endless growth. The house stood unshakably, but the foundation under Caleb's feet was already beginning to tremble. In the next part, we will see how personal tragedy and a moral dilemma forced him to make a fatal bet, trying to save this illusory paradise. By 1917, when the United States enters World War I, a new, invisible resident settles in the mansion on Johnson Street. His name is Fear. War changes the rules of the game. The government introduces strict rationing of products. Sugar, the blood of Bradham's business, becomes scarce. For an ordinary person, this means fewer sweets with tea. For Caleb Bradham, it means the stoppage of his empire's heart. It is here that the hero's moral erosion begins. From a visionary who wanted to give the world accessible energy, he turns into a man backed into a corner. His ambitions clash with the harsh reality of geopolitics, and in this struggle, the darkest sides of his character begin to emerge: stubbornness and a propensity for unjustified risk. During this period, a quiet human drama unfolds in the Slover Bradham house. Charity Creedle, his wife, becomes a witness to her husband's transformation. If earlier, at the dinner table, sat a confident captain of industry, now opposite her sits a man obsessed with commodity exchange reports. Testimonies from those years, preserved in Newburn archives, paint a picture of growing tension. Bradham becomes irritable. He spends less and less time with the children, more and more behind the closed doors of his office, clutching telegraph tapes in his hands. This is a classic conflict. The man built a house for family happiness, but now is ready to stake the well-being of this family to save the business. Pepsi Cola, his corporate child, begins to devour his real children. The deepest tragedy is that Bradham had a choice. By 1920, he was fabulously wealthy. He could have cut production, weathered the storm, preserved capital. But hubris is a poor advisor. Bradham perceived any retreat as a personal defeat. He could not allow store shelves to remain without his product, even if production was becoming unprofitable. Here the viewer must ask themselves, is he a hero trying to save his employees' jobs, or an egoist who cannot admit that he is not omnipotent? 1920 arrives. The war is over. Government control over sugar prices is lifted. This is the moment that should have brought relief, but instead it brings chaos. The market goes mad. The price of sugar, which had held at 5 cents per pound for years, begins a vertical climb. Speculators inflate prices: 9 cents, 15 cents, 20 cents. It is at this moment that Caleb Bradham makes the fatal mistake that turns him from a businessman into a tragic figure. He convinces himself that the price will rise forever. He believes the shortage will last for years. In his head echoes the voice of panic. If I don't buy sugar now, tomorrow it will cost 50 cents, and I am ruined. This is the false logic of a casino gambler who doubles bets when losing. In the spring of 1920, Bradham issues the order that will become his death sentence. He begins buying sugar futures on an industrial scale. He buys not for a month ahead. He buys reserves for years. He pays the peak price, 22 cents per pound. 22 cents. Remember this figure. It will become the epitaph on the grave of his fortune. He stuffs the warehouses to the brim, spending almost all the company's free funds and, worse, taking out huge loans secured by personal property. At that moment, charity probably sensed the impending disaster. Women's intuition often sees what male logic misses. But in the patriarchal world of the early 20th century South, a wife could not stop her husband, who considered himself a financial genius. She remained an observer in the golden cage, while her husband signed documents that effectively mortgaged the foundation of their life. The moral ambivalence of the situation reaches its peak in the summer of 1920. Bradham feels like a winner. He has sugar. His competitors do not, or so he thinks. He ensured uninterrupted production. He walks around New Bern with his head held high. But this is a feast during the plague. He does not notice that the market is already oversaturated. Sugarcane harvests in Cuba and other countries turn out to be record-breaking. Global logistics recovers faster than analysts expected. The bubble is ready to burst. The scene that concludes this part takes place not in a bank, but in the mansion's bedroom. Imagine Caleb Bradham who cannot sleep. He lies in the darkness, listening to the breathing of his sleeping wife. He defeated the shortage, but inside him grows a cold premonition. He put everything on one card. If the price falls even by a cent, he will lose millions. If it collapses, he will lose everything, including this house, this bed, and the respect of the woman sleeping beside him. Bradham wanted to become independent from the market, but with his actions he chained himself to it with bonds of debt obligations. He wanted to leave an empire to his children, but instead prepared them an inheritance in the form of bankruptcy. This was not just a miscalculation. This was an error in values. He forgot the first rule of business: never risk what you cannot afford to lose. By the end of 1920, the sugar price will falter, and when it goes down, it will not stop until it destroys the man who imagined he could dictate the terms of reality. The crisis was inevitable, and it was approaching at the speed of a telegraph signal. End of 1920. The world that Caleb Bradham so carefully built begins to collapse not with a crash, but with a whisper. First, there were rumors on the New York Exchange, then telegrams from brokers, and finally, newspaper headlines that screamed about market oversaturation. What happened to the sugar price in the following months, economists later called the sugar crash of 1920. For Bradham, it was tantamount to falling into an abyss without a safety net. The price, which peaked at 26 cents per pound in the spring, collapsed to 2 cents by December. This was not just a drop of 10 or 20%. This was the devaluation of an asset by 13 times. The mathematics of the catastrophe was murderously simple. Pepsi-Cola's warehouses were stuffed with raw materials bought for millions, which now cost pennies. Every can of soda coming off the conveyor brought not profit, but loss. The more they produced, the poorer they became. This was a financial paradox from which there was no escape. 1921 and 1922 became agony. Imagine the atmosphere in the mansion on Johnson Street in those days. The servants probably sensed the tension, seeing how the master of the house paled over the account books. The electric light, which he was so proud of, now illuminated not triumph, but despair. Bradham tried to save the ship. He restructured debts, he begged bankers, he sought investors. But the banking system is not a charity. When they saw his balance sheets, where under assets, sugar was listed at 10 times the market price, they slammed the doors. The credit line was cut. On May 31st, 1923, the inevitable happens. Pepsi-Cola Company officially declares bankruptcy. This was the day the dream died legally. But the cruelest blow came later, when the company's assets were put up for auction. The entire empire, patents, trademark, secret formula, equipment, factories, all of it went under the hammer. The buyer was a group of investors called Craven Holding Corporation. The deal price was $30,000. $30,000. Ponder this figure. The man spent almost half of this amount just on buying his house 15 years ago. Now, the work of his entire life, the brand known in 24 states, was sold for the price of a good string of horses. At that moment, Caleb Bradham lost everything except his honor and a roof over his head. And it is precisely here, at the point of absolute zero, that his true transformation begins. In stories of this scale, like The Great Gatsby or biographies of 1929 stockbrokers, the hero after the crash often chooses the easy way out, a bullet to the temple or a jump out the window. Public disgrace for a man of Southern aristocracy, even if new, was unbearable. Everyone in New Bern knew about his fall. People who yesterday tipped their hats to him, today whispered behind his back. But Caleb Bradham performs an act that requires much greater courage than suicide. He decides to live. He returns to where he started, to the pharmacy. Imagine this scene. 1924. Bradham, who is already 57 years old, former millionaire, former gubernatorial candidate, puts on a white coat and stands behind the counter of Bradham Drug Company. He begins mixing medicines again, selling aspirin and, by irony of fate, pouring soda for local residents. But now it is not his soda. The brand belongs to others. He is just a hired worker in his own past. This is a moment of transcendence. If earlier his goal was power and expansion, now his goal became dignity. He did not flee the city. He did not hide in his huge house, drawing the curtains. He went out to the people. He looked them in the eyes. And something amazing happened. The city did not turn away from him. On the contrary, New Bern residents saw humanity in this fall. Bradham ceased to be an unattainable magnate in a brick castle and became again Dr. Caleb, the man who knows the recipe for a headache. His mansion on Johnson Street also changed its meaning. Previously, it was a symbol of ambitions, a showcase of success, a place for receiving senators. Now it turned into a fortress, protecting the family from adversity. The house stopped being an asset and became just a home, a place where they live, where they love, where they experience grief. Bradham preserved the mansion, probably thanks to legal subtleties of titling it in his wife's name, or remnants of personal savings that did not enter the bankruptcy estate. But maintaining such a giant became a burden. In winter, the family closed off parts of the rooms to save on coal. Grandeur gave way to pragmatism. The stucco on the ceilings still reminded of the days of glory, but now it was a witness to modest dinners, not banquets. In these years, Bradham reconsidered the concept of wealth. He lost money, but preserved influence of another kind. He remained chairman of the bank board, although without capital. He continued to participate in the life of the Masonic Lodge. He helped organize scholarships for students, those same ones he himself was when his father went bankrupt. He closed the gestalt of his father not through accumulating gold, but through accepting fate. He realized that the name Bradham meant something in New Bern, not because of the bottling plant, but because of how he held up under the blows of fate. The second character, his wife Charity, reveals herself in a new light during this period. If during the years of ascent she was the ornament of his life, then in the years of collapse, she became his backbone. She did not leave him. She did not go to relatives. She accepted the new reality with the stoicism inherent to women of that time. It was precisely her presence in the house, her renunciation of social life to preserve the family hearth, that allowed Caleb not to go mad. Their marriage, entered into as a strategic alliance, passed the test of fire and became the union of two survivors. The crisis cleansed Bradham of the chaff of vanity. He no longer chased phantoms of the future. He lived in the here and now. Every dollar earned at the pharmacy was real, unlike the millions on paper that evaporated in 1920. He paid his bills. He greeted his neighbors. He became a living monument to his own mistake, but a monument that inspired respect, not pity. But the story does not end there. While Bradham mixed powders in his pharmacy in New Bern, his creation, Pepsi Cola, began to live its own separate life. The new owners, who bought the company for a song, also could not lift it immediately. The brand passed from hand to hand. It balanced on the brink of disappearance. It was even offered for sale to Coca-Cola, which arrogantly refused, committing one of the greatest mistakes in business history. Bradham watched this from afar. What was it like to see your name, written in your own handwriting on the logo, being resuscitated by other people? Did he feel jealousy? Or perhaps relief that this burden no longer weighed on his shoulders? By the beginning of the 1930s, Caleb's health began to fail. Years of stress, overwork, and possibly the bitterness of loss undermined his heart. He still returned every evening to the house on Johnson Street, climbed the worn steps, passed by the mirrors that remembered him young and rich. But now, in the reflection, he saw not a failed businessman, but a man who had endured. He transformed his tragedy into a quiet lesson in humility. He did not become the king of soda he dreamed of being. He remained simply a pharmacist from New Bern. And in this simplicity, there was more truth than in all the advertising slogans he had ever devised. In the final part of our story, we will travel to our days to see what remains of this legacy today, and what lesson we, living in the era of new economic bubbles and instant fortunes, can draw from Caleb Bradham's ruined dream. We will learn why his failure is actually a mirror for each of us. February 19, 1934. On this day, Caleb Bradham's heart stopped. But the cruelest irony of this story lies not in the death of its main hero, but in what happened immediately after. Fate has a perverted sense of humor. The very economic catastrophe that should have buried America, the Great Depression, became rocket fuel for the brand that Bradham created and lost. While the body of the former magnate was cooling in the ground of Cedar Grove Cemetery, the new owners of the company, who bought its assets for humiliating $30,000, did what aristocratic Bradham would never have done. They devalued the product to save it. They began selling a 12-ounce bottle for just 5 cents. Twice as much for the same money. This slogan spread across the impoverished country like wildfire. Pepsi became champagne for the unemployed, a symbol of small joy in an era of despair. At the moment when Bradham's family mourned the loss of the breadwinner, somewhere in New York, cash registers began ringing at unprecedented speed. The brand rose from the dead, using Caleb's name, his font, his formula, but bringing not a cent to his heirs. This was a posthumous identity theft on a planetary scale. Let us return to the mansion on Johnson Street, 201. What happened to this brick fortress after the death of the general? In most bankruptcy stories, the house is taken by creditors and the family ends up on the street. But here the scenario took a different, more tormenting path. Caleb's widow, Charity, and their children stayed in the house. They owned it until 1973. Almost 40 years the family lived inside the monument to their own lost empire. Imagine the psychological atmosphere of those decades. Huge halls with high ceilings, designed for balls and receptions of senators, now witnessed only the quiet fading of an old lineage. Furniture bought for thousands of dollars at the beginning of the century was aging, the upholstery wearing out, but there was nothing to replace it with. The mansion turned into a museum of unfulfilled hopes, where every interior item screamed of past greatness. Living here meant waking up every day inside one's main mistake. It was not a house, it was a sarcophagus. The Bradham family kept a roof over their heads, but they became prisoners of their own history, guardians of an altar whose deity had long died. Today, when PepsiCo's capitalization exceeds $230 billion, Caleb Bradham's story reads like a frightening prophecy for the modern economy. We are accustomed to thinking that people of the past were more naive than us, that they did not know algorithms, risk hedging, and technical analysis. But Bradham's crash is an absolute copy of modern financial bubbles. His purchase of futures at 22 cents per pound is classic FOMO, which today makes people buy Bitcoin at peak prices, mortgaging their apartments. Bradham was the smartest man of his time, a pharmacist, a strategist, but in the face of greed and fear, his IQ zeroed out. But there is another layer of legacy that cannot be measured in money. It is the question of authorship and alienation. Today, the Pepsi logo is a red, white, blue circle, an abstraction. But if you look at cans released in retro style, you will see that very ornate font. This is Caleb's hand. This is the movement of his brush, made in the back room of the pharmacy in 1898. Billions of people have seen this handwriting. It has become part of humanity's visual code, on par with the cross or the crescent. Caleb Bradham achieved immortality. But this immortality turned out to be completely detached from his personality. He became a ghost in the corporate machine. No one who drinks soda at a stadium or in a movie theater knows about the tragedy in New Bern. They do not know about the warehouses stuffed with rotting sugar. They do not know about the sleepless nights in the office on the second floor of the mansion. The product devoured its creator. This is, perhaps, the most terrifying outcome for any creator. When your creation becomes so great that it no longer needs its father. If you come to New Bern today, you will find a city that remembers. The Slover Bradham mansion stands in its place, restored by new owners, shining with the same red brick as 100 years ago. Now it is a historical landmark. Tourists stop to photograph the home of the Pepsi creator. The pharmacy at the corner of Middle and Pollock has also been restored as a museum. There you can buy a souvenir bottle, stand at the very spot where the soda fountain stood. But if you want to truly understand the finale of this story, you need to go not to the museum or the mansion. You need to walk to Cedar Grove Cemetery. Find the grave with the name Caleb Davis Bradham. It is quiet there.
the noise of the global corporation, the clank of conveyor belts, the ring of billions of dollars, all that remained in another dimension. Here lies a man who lost the game called capitalism, but won the game called humanity. The last years of his life, spent behind the pharmacy counter, were not a fall, but an ascent. He showed that dignity does not depend on stock quotes. He looked his neighbors in the eye, knowing that they knew, and he did not look away. In a world where success is measured only by the zeros in an account, Bradham's story reminds us that there are things that cannot be bought, and there are things that cannot be sold, even at a bankruptcy auction.
Caleb Bradham's story is not just a business case from textbooks. It is a classical tragedy in the setting of the 20th century. It is a reminder that between genius and madman, between visionary and bankrupt, lies a thin line, the width of just 1 cent in the price of sugar. And the next time you hear the characteristic sound of an opening can, remember that it is not just the sound of escaping gas. It is the sound with which empires collapse. It is the echo of the starter pistol shot in the race that Caleb Bradham started, but never reached the finish line. His fortune is destroyed. His mansion belongs to others. His grave is overgrown with grass. But the taste that he invented to heal his neighbors' stomachs, now graces every tongue on the planet. Perhaps this is the true price of eternity: to give everything, to remain just a word on the label.